I never expected my parents to straight up demand that I hand over the $30,000 I had worked so hard to save for college, just so my spoiled sister could get herself a fancy apartment. I'm 19, a college student, and, for as long as I can remember, I've always felt like the outsider in my own family. I've spent years working my ass off, studying, keeping my grades up, and even landing a scholarship, thinking that maybe, just maybe, my efforts would finally earn me some respect. But I was wrong. My parents have always put my sister on a pedestal. She's their perfect, golden child, the one who gets whatever she wants, no questions asked. Meanwhile, I've always been expected to be the responsible one, the one who figures things out on his own. Whenever she made a mess, I was the one expected to clean it up. Whenever she needed something, I was the one who had to sacrifice. Still, despite all that, I managed to save up $30,000 for college. It wasn't some gift or lucky break. I earned every penny through part-time jobs and scholarships. That money was my way out, my chance at a future where I wasn't dependent on anyone. But to my parents, it was nothing more than an easy solution to Sarah's latest problem. Sarah is 24, but you'd think she was still a teenager with the way she acts. She's never had to work for anything. She's been coddled her whole life. Right now, she doesn't have a job and hasn't for a while. She claims she's figuring things out, but in reality, she just sits around all day doing nothing. And yet, she's somehow decided that she needs a brand new apartment, something stylish, in a nice area. Of course, she has no savings and no income, so who do my parents think should cover the cost? Me. One night, they sat me down and blindsided me with their demand. Sarah had found the perfect place, but she couldn't afford the deposit. Their solution? I was supposed to hand over my entire college fund, all of it, so she could move in. At first, I thought I misheard them. They weren't asking, they were telling me. And to make it even worse, they made it clear that if I refused, I could pack my bags and leave. In their eyes, my future didn't matter nearly as much as making sure Sarah got what she wanted. Then came the guilt tripping. My mom went on about how family comes first, while my dad tried to spin some nonsense about how Sarah had always supported me, which couldn't have been further from the truth. They made me out to be the bad guy, saying that if I was a good brother, I wouldn't even hesitate. For a while, I just sat there, stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I finally found the words, I asked how they could possibly think it was fair for me to throw away everything I'd worked for just because Sarah refused to take care of herself. My dad shrugged, saying it was about keeping the family together. My mom insisted that Sarah needed it more than I did. That was the moment it hit me. They weren't going to listen. They didn't care about what was fair. They only cared about Sarah. For days, I felt completely stuck. I considered giving in just to keep the peace. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how messed up it was. Why should I have to destroy my future just so my sister, who had done absolutely nothing to help herself, could get what she wanted? But standing up for myself meant taking a huge risk. If they actually kicked me out, I had nowhere to go. I even thought about reaching out to other family members, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Most of them had always taken Sarah's side. I felt like no matter what I did, I was going to lose. In the end, I made my decision. I wasn't going to let them control me. I started looking into my legal rights, knowing full well that, as an adult, they had no right to touch my money. I also made sure to secure all my important documents, passport, birth certificate, bank information, just in case things got worse. Quietly, I began moving some of my valuables to a friend's place, preparing for the possibility that I'd have to leave in a hurry. Since getting kicked out was a real possibility, I reached out to my college's housing office to see if they had any emergency accommodations. They didn't, but they gave me some resources that could help. It wasn't much, but at least it was something. Finally, I faced my parents head on. I told them flat out that I wasn't handing over my money. And if that meant they were going to throw me out, then so be it. My dad lost it, yelling about how selfish and ungrateful I was. My mom burst into tears, acting like I was the one tearing the family apart over a little money. If it was really a little money, then why didn't they pay for it themselves? And, of course, Sarah reacted exactly how I expected. She threw a full-blown tantrum, screaming about how I was ruining her life and that I didn't care about her happiness. My parents just stood there, staring me down, waiting for me to break. But I wasn't going to. I met their eyes and told them that if they wanted me gone, I'd be out by the end of the week. The days that followed were unbearable. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was only to make me feel guilty. My mom refused to acknowledge me at all, treating me like I wasn't even there. My dad, on the other hand, made sure I knew exactly what he thought of me, throwing bitter comments my way whenever he got the chance. Sarah wouldn't even look at me, acting as if I had done something unforgivable. They kept up their act, hoping to wear me down, hoping I'd change my mind. But I didn't. Instead, I quietly kept getting ready to leave. I moved the last of my valuables to my friend's place without them knowing, just in case things got worse. I also reached out to some other friends, letting them know what was going on. They were supportive, and even suggested I look into legal action if my parents tried anything else. Then, everything escalated. One morning, I found out my parents had tried to get into my bank account. They must have thought they could take the money and deal with my reaction later. But I had already been one step ahead of them. I had withdrawn everything and closed the account. When they realized what I had done, they lost it. My dad started yelling, calling me ungrateful and blaming me for tearing the family apart. My mom just cried, asking me over and over how I could do this to them, as if I was the one who had betrayed them. But I wasn't about to cave. I told them straight up that they had crossed a line, and that I was done being the one they used whenever they wanted. If they wanted me out, I'd go, but they weren't getting a single cent from me. I knew if I just left quietly, they'd twist the story to make themselves look like the victims. So, before they could do that, I made sure everyone knew the truth. I posted everything on social media, how they tried to take my college savings, the threats, the manipulation. I even attached screenshots of their texts and proof that they had attempted to access my bank account. I wanted to make sure there was no way for them to spin the story in their favor, so I tagged not only my parents and Sarah, but also some of their friends and extended family. If they wanted to act like the perfect family, I was about to show people who they really were. The reaction was instant. People were shocked. Most of my extended family had no idea things were this bad. A few of my parents' friends tried to defend them, but they were drowned out by the sheer number of people calling them out. And then, the real consequences started to hit them. My dad's reputation at work took a hit as people began to see him differently. My mom, who always cared about what people thought of her, started getting shut out of her usual social circles. And Sarah? She lost her shot at the apartment when the landlord found out about what was happening and decided not to rent to her. She was furious, blaming me for everything. But I didn't care. They had done this to themselves. After that, I moved in with a friend who had been supporting me through everything. It wasn't ideal, but it was still 1,000 times better than living under my parents' roof. Adjusting to life on my own was hard, but at the same time, it felt like I could finally breathe. For once, I could focus on my future without the fear of my family trying to take everything from me. My parents didn't handle the fallout well. They bombarded me with calls and messages, flipping back and forth between threats and begging me to take down the post and come home. They even tried to twist the story, saying I had overreacted and that they were only trying to help Sarah out. But it was too late. The damage was done. I made the decision to cut them off completely. I blocked them everywhere and made sure they couldn't contact me. I even spoke to a lawyer about possibly getting a restraining order if they kept trying to interfere in my life. It wasn't an easy choice, but I knew it was the right one. I refused to let them keep dragging me into their toxic mess. After everything, a few distant relatives reached out, apologizing for not realizing what was happening sooner. My college even stepped in to offer extra financial aid when they heard about my situation, which was a huge relief. Looking back, I know I've changed. I'm stronger, more independent, and finally in control of my own life. Without the constant stress of dealing with my family, my grades have even improved. And I've built a new support system, real friends who actually care about me and who I know I can trust. Now, I'm focused on building a future where I never have to rely on them again. I'm seriously considering cutting ties for good. The cycle of guilt and favoritism ends with me. It won't be easy, but I'm ready to move forward. So, was I wrong for refusing to give up my college savings and exposing my family for what they really are? Update 1. It's been 3 months since I first shared my story, and a lot has happened. First, I just want to say thank you to everyone who supported me. Your advice really helped me through some of the hardest moments of my life. After I left and told the world what had happened, things only got worse. My parents and Sarah didn't take it well at all. They kept trying to reach me, switching between anger and guilt tripping. I stuck to my no-contact rule, but that didn't stop them from trying. About a week after I moved out, my mom showed up at my friend's place. I still don't know how she found out where I was staying. She was crying, begging me to come home, saying they had made a mistake and wanted to fix things. For a second, I almost believed her. But then she went right back to blaming me, saying I was the one breaking up the family, and that Sarah was struggling because of me. That's when I knew nothing had really changed. I told her to leave, and if she didn't, I would call the police. She left, but not before telling me I was breaking her heart. The next day, my dad took things even further. He called my college, trying to get information about my class schedule. Thankfully, I had already spoken with administration, so they didn't tell him anything. But just knowing that he was trying to track me down like that freaked me out. That was the moment I knew. Cutting them off wasn't just the best choice. It was the only choice. Sarah wouldn't let it go. She started showing up everywhere. The library, the coffee shop near campus, even outside my classes. She'd wait for me, trying to trap me in a conversation. Some days she'd scream at me, calling me a selfish piece of trash for ruining her life. Other times, she'd suddenly switch gears, begging me to reconsider, saying she needed the money. It got so bad that I had to change my entire routine. I stopped going to my usual spots and started having friends walk with me between classes just to avoid running into her. Then, about a month after I left home, my aunt called me, my mom's sister. She told me she wanted to talk, saying she was worried about me. I was hesitant, but she had always been one of the few family members who treated me kindly, so I agreed to meet her. We chose a public place, just in case. When I arrived, my gut told me something was off. And then I saw them. My parents were sitting at a nearby table, watching me. They had set me up. I felt like an idiot for trusting her. Without saying a word, I turned around and left. Later that day, I blocked her number 2. Meanwhile, my parents weren't done trying to control the story. They went on social media, spinning their own version of events. They claimed I was a troubled, rebellious kid who had stolen money from them and ran away. Some people bought it, but most didn't. It was painful seeing distant relatives and family friends take sides, but I was grateful for the ones who stood by me. Then Sarah decided to take it to the next level. She started a GoFundMe. She claimed she was the victim of financial abuse and needed help escaping a toxic family situation. She even used my name, making it seem like I was the one who had mistreated her. I was beyond furious. I had no choice but to get a lawyer involved to take the fundraiser down. And speaking of lawyers, my parents actually threatened legal action against me. They sent messages saying I owed them money for raising me, that I was ungrateful, and that they had a right to my savings. I knew they were bluffing, but it still shook me. I went back to my lawyer, who reassured me they had no case. He also told me to keep records of everything, just in case they tried to pull something worse. Then, about 2.5 months after I left, something completely unexpected happened. I got an email from Jack, Sarah's ex-boyfriend. They had broken up months before all of this, and while we had never been close, I had always thought he was a decent guy who got dragged into my family's mess. He apologized for not reaching out sooner, and said he had been following what happened. He wanted me to know that he was on my side. And then he told me something that completely changed the way I saw my sister. Apparently, Sarah had been cheating on him the entire time they were together, mostly with guys who could buy her expensive gifts or take her on luxury trips. She had told him repeatedly that she deserved a better life, and that it was unfair she had to work for anything. But that wasn't even the worst part. Jack told me that Sarah had been fired from her last job for stealing. My parents covered it up. They paid back the money to keep the company from pressing charges. And yet these same parents, who had protected Sarah after she had actually committed a crime, had thrown me out because I wouldn't give up the money I had earned for college. I was furious. Then, 3 months after I left, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. It was my grandfather, my dad's father. We had never been close. He lived in another state, and I had only seen him a handful of times. He told me he had heard about everything from a cousin and wanted to hear my side of the story. After what happened with my aunt, I wasn't sure I could trust him. But as we talked, I realized he was genuinely concerned. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. He said he had his own problems with my dad over the years. He wasn't shocked by what had happened. In fact, he apologized for not being around more when I was growing up. Then he made me an offer. He told me that if I ever needed financial help, he would be there for me. I was touched, but I told him I wanted to stand on my own. He respected that but told me his offer would always stand. It meant more than I could put into words, knowing that someone in my family actually cared. That conversation made me wonder about my other relatives. I decided to reach out to some cousins on my mom's side. One of them, Megan, ended up telling me something that made me even angrier. A few years ago, Megan was going through a bad divorce and needed a place to stay for a few weeks. My parents had offered to let her stay with them. But then Sarah complained. She didn't want Megan invading her space. So my parents kicked Megan out after 3 days. She had nowhere to go and ended up sleeping on friends' couches until she could find an apartment. And yet, these were the same people who demanded that I give up everything for Sarah. At that point, I was still trying to figure out my long-term living situation. My friends' parents had been incredibly kind, letting me stay with them, but I knew I had to find a place of my own. Then, out of nowhere, I ran into one of Sarah's friends at the grocery store. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying Sarah was so depressed and that I was the reason. I just looked at her and asked, "Did Sarah tell you the full story?" She hesitated. I could tell she hadn't. So, I told her everything. By the time I was done, she didn't say much, just looked confused and walked away. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory. Then, the next day, I got a call from my bank. Someone had tried to access my new account using my social security number. The bank flagged it as suspicious and blocked it. I didn't need to guess who it was. It was my parents. That was it. That was the final straw. I filed a police report and put a freeze on my credit. Then I went straight to my lawyer and began the process of filing a restraining order against my parents and Sarah. The day before the hearing, my mom called me, crying. She begged me not to go through with it. She said it would destroy the family, that it would ruin their lives. I told her they should have thought about that before they tried to steal from me and harass me. Then I hung up. The court hearing was brutal. My parents and Sarah showed up with a lawyer. They tried to paint me as some ungrateful, rebellious kid who was attacking his own family. But I had proof. I had the texts, the emails, the bank records, the social media posts. The judge saw through the lies. The restraining order was granted. As I left the courthouse, Sarah tried to stop me one last time. She looked awful, like she hadn't slept in weeks. At first, it seemed like she was going to apologize. But then, her face twisted with rage, and she spat out, "I hope you're happy now that you've ruined all our lives." A court officer stepped in, grabbing Sarah by the arm as she kept yelling. She struggled for a moment, her face twisting with rage, but she had no choice. She was being escorted out. That was the last time I saw her. With that chapter finally closed, I turned my focus toward building a life for myself. I picked up a part-time job to cover my living expenses. Balancing work and school wasn't easy, but for the first time, every dollar I earned belonged to me. I didn't owe anyone anything, and that feeling was worth every struggle. I won't pretend it's been easy. There are days when I miss having a family, even if they were toxic. Holidays, especially, hit hard. No matter how much I remind myself that walking away was the right choice, there's still that small part of me that wonders how things could have been different if my family had just treated me with basic respect. But I don't dwell on it. I keep moving forward. Final update. It's been a year since my last update, and honestly, I can't believe how much has changed. First, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has followed and supported me through all of this. Your words and encouragement have meant more than I can ever express. After the restraining order was granted, things were quiet. Too quiet. For a while, I thought maybe my family had finally let go, that they had moved on. But the calm never lasts, does it? About 3 months ago, I got an unexpected call from my uncle, my dad's brother. We had never been particularly close, so I was surprised to hear from him. The moment he spoke, I could tell something was wrong. He told me that things had completely fallen apart with my parents and Sarah. Apparently, Sarah had gotten involved with some dangerous people and racked up a huge amount of debt. And in their usual fashion, my parents bailed her out. They took out a second mortgage on their house to try and cover what she owed. But it wasn't enough. Then, one night, the people Sarah owed money to showed up at my parents' house. My uncle didn't have all the details, but he knew things got violent. The police had to be called, and my dad ended up in the hospital with a broken arm. And here's the kicker, my parents still tried to protect Sarah. Instead of telling the police what really happened, they lied. They told officers it was just a random break-in. But word got out. Other family members heard the truth. A few days after my uncle's call, my parents started messaging me again. After a year of silence, they suddenly wanted to talk. Against my better judgment, I unblocked them. Big mistake. They weren't calling to apologize. They weren't calling to make amends. They were begging me to come home. They said they needed my help. And then, they had the audacity to say that if I had just given them the money when they first asked, none of this would have happened. Even after everything, they still blamed me. I didn't respond. I blocked them again and moved on. Since then, I've saved up enough to move into my own apartment. It's not big, but it's in a safe neighborhood and gives me the peace of mind I never had growing up. It's further from campus, but I don't mind. It's mine. But just when I thought I was finally free, Sarah found me. One evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, she was standing there, ignoring the restraining order. I have no idea how she figured out where I lived, especially since I had just moved. She looked terrible, disheveled, shaking, desperate. She started crying, begging me for money, saying she was in danger. I told her to leave. She didn't. Instead, she started screaming. She yelled that I was killing her, that if anything happened to her, it would be my fault. I slammed the door in her face and called my lawyer. We're now in the process of extending the restraining order to include my new address. I also informed my landlord and neighbors, just in case Sarah or my parents try anything again. And as if all of this wasn't bad enough, I recently found out that my parents have been spreading even more lies about me. They're telling family members that I was the one who got Sarah involved with these shady people, that I owe money to. It's absolute nonsense. But some people believe them. I started getting hateful messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. I had to block dozens of them on social media. At this point, I don't even care. I've built a new life. Over the past year, I've made real friends. Friends who actually care about me. Friends who are more of a family than my own ever was. We're even planning a celebration soon, just because. And as for my parents and Sarah, I heard through the grapevine that they're facing foreclosure on the house. A part of me feels bad for them, but a bigger part of me knows that this is the result of their own choices.